Trigger warning. This story has mentions about death and suicide and talks of depression as well. Please proceed with caution. The one that got away. I remembered seeing Jeff sitting across the other coach on a Monday, of all days, but perhaps the real reason why I remembered him, truly remembered him, was because of what happened 3 days later on the same metro route. First, however, I needed to rethink what happened on day one. When I first saw Jeff Frost, I was very close to looking away. I had often done that with the strangers I came across on a day-to-day basis, but then something caught my eye. I wasn't sure what it was until much later, but then I first saw Jeff, I really couldn't look away. He had curly brown hair sitting atop a finely made face. There was a few red pimples visible even from this distance, and his lips looked chapped. But the most familiar thing I saw in him that day was most definitely his eyes. They looked exactly like mine whenever I looked in a mirror. Exhausted and with thin under-eye circles. Then I looked at his slim sunken shoulders and the slim wrists that I was pretty sure a man of his age shouldn't have, and I immediately thought I needed to talk to him before it was too late. Too late for what? I didn't have an answer, and even if I had, then I didn't want to say it out loud in fear that they would mirror mine, because as much as I hated that instant connections, I knew I had already grown fond of the stranger on the metro with a few glances. The next day, when I got out of my office, I ran for my life to the subway. I hoped to catch the same metro that I'd caught on Monday with the single wish that I'd get to see him again. Luck seemed to be on my side because, after a little surge, I found him sitting on one of the seats. Bravely, I casually strolled towards him and hoped to grab the empty seat next to him. Unfortunately, I was not so lucky. Someone hurried along and claimed the seat for themselves. I huffed and leaned against the door. Why was I so slow for everything I wanted out of life? And wasn't that one of the reasons why I was stuck doing what I was doing? Years ago, when I had just been a little boy, my father had grabbed me by the shoulders and asked me what I wanted to do with my life. I was little, and so I said I wanted to do something that would require me to wear a suit. Now, I was wearing a suit. But was I as happy as I had seen my father? No, certainly not. I was making twice as much as Dad, but neither was I happy nor was I content. I was mentally draining. How boring my life had become. I'd wake up in the mornings to get myself some breakfast and then rush to the subway. Then I'd spend the next 8 hours in the office, rush to the subway and feared that if I didn't make it quickly, I would have to deal with the evening rush and then get home and sometimes exercise, and sometimes not. It was boring and like a routine. If luck were on my side, some of my friends would recommend a nice place for us to all visit, and we'd spend some good hours there. Then it would start all over again. Sometimes, my parents would come over to spend time with me, and that was all the social interactions I had these days. Sometimes I would dream of seeing him beneath the layers he'd draped over himself. Not lavishly, no, but out of curiosity, and to see what familiar marks he bore over himself. I guess that was it. I was fascinated by the stranger because I was curious. I was curious to see if he and I were alike in more ways than one, because I knew that somehow that would make my life less burdensome. Otherwise, what else would explain my attraction to him? As the days passed and Jeff didn't seem to change much in appearance, I knew we had to talk. And well, the opportunity presented itself in weird ways. On Friday of the same week, Jeff and I happened to stand in the same car. The metro was crowded, giving the surprising evening rush, and Jeff and I happened to stand too close. He looked as sleepy as he had looked to me in the past few days. Bravely, I stood straighter and hoped to provide the steadiness that his body probably needed right now. He unconsciously seemed to appreciate the gesture because some 5 minutes into the ride, he was slightly leaning against me. I took it as a win, and for the first time in a while, I knew it was glowing. But it was going to be a short-lived experience. 5 minutes more and Jeff was no longer slightly leaning against me. He had draped himself over me, as if I were some comfortable bed for him. I was okay with that. He looked like he needed the comfort of a bed. But then he went so still that I feared he'd actually fallen asleep. As okay as I was about that, I knew that it was neither safe nor unconcerning. I held him around his waist and shook him just slightly enough that no bad person around us could notice that. It took him a while to move, and when he did, he placed a hand over my chest to steady himself. I was sure he could hear the rapid beating of my heart, despite my thick suit jacket. Perhaps it was because of that he immediately removed his hand and looked around for something to balance himself. I subtly removed my arm from his waist, worried that he might misunderstand the touch. "I'm sorry," he softly mumbled, and I could hear the sleepiness in his tone. "It's all right," I told him, and dipped my head slightly so that our words remained between us only. but be careful from now on." He furrowed his eyebrows as if annoyed by any insinuation that he wasn't careful with himself. "I'm always careful," he muttered bitterly. "Maybe you should keep your hands to yourself, man." Now it was my turn to feel irritated, but despite that, I leveled my tone. I wasn't going to scare him away now that we'd finally started talking. "I only did that so you don't fall." He looked around the crowded car. There was little space to move, so I was sure he didn't really believe my words. But that was the truth. So I only felt slightly ashamed of myself. "Plenty of people have said and done that," he muttered, and dipped his head again, as if to say that the conversation was over. I swallowed my response and huffed. I was so sorry that people had taken advantage of his vulnerability, but I didn't feel bitter about the way he had responded to me. I knew it was hard dealing with some people, especially for those who seemed to be on the edge every minute of their lives. Despite our first conversation happening so, I didn't feel bitter about him or our first interaction. I still hoped that we'd get some opportunity to talk again, so that I could set the record straight and inform him that I had no ill intent. And God did listen to me, because some 10 minutes later, just before the stop, I knew he got off on. He fell against me. I knew he had fallen asleep, but I also knew missing the station was more annoying. Just like before, I shook him a little. He moved and looked up again. Before he could complain about any touch, I showed him my other hand and smiled, a little awkwardly. "I think it's your station," I told him. That definitely did not sound creepy, Ryan. The man again furrowed his eyebrows. "How do you know?" "You know what? Never mind." He turned slightly and patted the shoulders of the people in front of us and asked them if they wanted to get off too. He was extraordinarily polite, and that seemed to move something in me. Before he left, he nodded at me and murmured a small but shy thank you. Stupid as it was, I took that small thank you with me to my sleep. Suddenly, life didn't seem as boring as I'd decided it was. The next day. It was Saturday, and I was actually excited for the day. Well, not exactly for the office or the day ahead, but that would come after all those grudging hours at my workplace. The stranger, more specifically. If things went well, maybe we'd even get to properly talk, and maybe then I'd get to introduce myself and get to know him. The more fantasies I made of the day, the more I hoped that the day at the office would be as uneventful as it usually was. Obviously, that was like hoping for far too much. The traffic rush was insane this Saturday for some reason. Obviously, that meant that I was late to the office too. By the time I had arrived at the office in a rush, I saw my boss standing next to my cubicle and impatiently tapping his feet. I knew from the sight alone that my day wasn't going to be well at all. I sighed and dragged my feet to my cubicle. "Ah, look who has time to grace us with his presence. Finally, Mr. Newman." I subtly rolled my eyes. Wasn't ever going to get used to his presence. "Sorry," I replied and put my bag on my desk. "Traffic. I'm not sure why. You should have left earlier," he replied. "I did," I replied. Soon, though, I realized that it was stupid to argue. Then I nodded my head and promised that I would keep that in mind. "Also, Ryan," he said before leaving, "I want Simpson's report on my table before you leave. Make sure to leave only after that." The actual hell, Simpson's report wasn't due till next Friday. But I also knew he was an irrational man by nature, and I wasn't really in the mood to deal with him of all people. I decided I was still going to be hopeful about the evening, and to make that happen, I had to finish this report on time. By the time the clock hit 5, I wasn't yet done. By my calculations, it was going to take me at least another 25 minutes. I groaned and moaned and mournfully watched my colleagues leave one after another. A few of them patted my back in silent sympathy, and then went about their day. It wasn't like I was actually expecting them this day, though. That would have been nice. I was racing against time as I typed out the information and prepared the charts, but by the time the clock hit 5:15, I knew it was a lost cause. I wasn't going to see that beautiful stranger today. The emotion that erupted inside me nearly brought tears to my eyes. I was just so much hated by my boss. I was sure I was going to leave this place the moment I found something else. I couldn't care less if it would be better or worse than this place. Anywhere but here. When it was finally done, I emailed it to my boss and then walked to his cabin. I knew he wasn't going to leave before 7, and I hoped he wasn't in the mood to make me stay as well. I wasn't going to come out as an innocent man from this cabin if that were to happen. Thankfully, he didn't seem in the mood either. An hour or so later, I rushed to the subway, and despite knowing any better, I hoped that I would see the guy again. It was past 6:30, so the chance of that happening was slim to none. I wasn't even sure if he worked on Saturdays either. I sighed and grabbed my phone from my pocket. Mom was calling and I had to pick up. In the middle of talking, I looked to my left and no one would believe me. I found the guy walking towards this side of the station. What? I quickly bid my mom goodbye and pocketed my phone. Was this a sign from above? Although I was excited to see him, I couldn't help but notice his slightly messy appearance. What did he do as a job? As exhausted as he looked so wearily unaware of his surroundings that I was worried that one day he'd fall in the tracks and never get up in hopes that he wouldn't have a reason to. The thought seemed to strike something personal in me. After all, I had spent my nights fantasizing about the same. I ran a hand through my messy hair when he stood next to me. I wasn't sure if he recognized me, the way I recognized him the first time I had seen him, but his obliviousness didn't seem to tamper my feelings and excitement for him. I didn't think anything could possibly do that. When our metro arrived, I followed after him. The metro wasn't as crowded today, and a few seats were even left empty. He sat on one of them, and I bravely sat on his side. This was it, I told myself. This was the time to make a move and leave an impression. Because if today didn't work, then I was sure it wasn't ever going to work. When the man leaned against his seat and stared at nothing, I cleared my throat. I knew I shouldn't have. He was somewhere where I often found myself. Why couldn't I respect the same obliviousness that I desperately wanted others to acknowledge in me? It seemed to catch the guy's attention, and he looked at me curiously. "Hi," I said, and inwardly cringed. I was bothering him more. The guy furrowed his eyebrows. "Hi," he replied. "Do I know you?" There it was. He didn't remember me from yesterday. But honestly, there was little chance of that actually happening. He was sleepy and tired, but I was still hoping he'd remember me. We talked after all. "I'm the guy from yesterday," I said. "Okay," he said, and dragged the word. Adding that I was the same guy he'd leaned against. Didn't really seem appropriate, but I wasn't sure how else to remind him. "I was standing next to you yesterday. I stopped and rubbed my elbow. You told me not to touch your waist." Was that the best way to tell someone you were a friendly person and not at all harmful and dangerous? What the hell, I thought to myself. Who even introduced themselves like that? "Oh," he said. "The guy who helped me," he said. "Uh-huh." Now that was a good sign. "Yes, that one." "I'm sorry I was so rude yesterday," he said and sat up straighter. Like this, I could clearly see he was smaller and slimmer than I had once thought. It was concerning. His sunken eyes but youthful face told me he must not be older than 23, or perhaps even younger. So he was around my age. It was unbecoming of me. I told Daisy about it yesterday, and she scolded me for being rude to kind strangers. So I am sorry. I don't usually come across kind people. That was too much information. What was I supposed to reply to first? "I'm glad to hear that. I wanted to know who Daisy was." I chewed on my bottom lip. "I'm glad someone saved my image and reputation." The guy gave a small laugh. "Well, that's what she does best, but I do believe children are better judges of characters." Was she his daughter? I agree. How old is she? Well, 9 turning 10 in 2 months. Sometimes she stays with me, sometimes with mom or dad, though she prefers her brother more. Her brother? Me, he answered. I immediately let out a sigh of relief. "Oh, she's your sister." "Yeah, what were you thinking?" "Nothing," I replied and let out a nervous laugh. How was I so embarrassing? "I'm Ryan Newman." I gave him my hand. He took my hand with a smile. "Hi, Ryan, I'm Jeff." I turned to him and spoke some more. Well, now that wasn't too bad, was it? The next Monday, 2 days later, and I could proudly say I knew a little more about Jeff than I knew on Friday. I knew his full name, Jeff Frost. I knew he was 22 and he lived separately from his parents because of some personal issues. His sister Daisy often came over to his place to meet him. His parents didn't really care much about it, and that was one of the few things that I couldn't relate to. He worked a lot, and that didn't only concern the hours, but jobs as well. He currently had 3 menial jobs and another slightly better one that took most of his time. Still, I knew he earned less than me. He was struggling, and each time that he spoke or moved his wrist this or that way, I couldn't help but think back 2 or 3 years back when I was the same. Sure, things hadn't changed much. I still had nights where I couldn't sleep, and I still had days where I didn't want to move, but it was better than what I was doing back then. Seeing Jeff in the same position, where Jeff was sure he was constantly messing up his life at the young age of 22, brought a new kind of tension within me. Now my nights were no longer preoccupied with the thoughts of myself and my issues, or the fact that I was hungry but would rather starve than actually eat. They now concerned Jeff. 1 week and I was moving in a manner that I knew Ryan from 2 weeks ago wouldn't ever relate to. Now I hoped to hold his hand or give him a hug or two. My office hours were spent wondering if I'd met Jeff or not, or if I would give a chance to speak to him. Often, Jeff forgot the things that I told him. When I'd remind him again, he would reply that he remembered me telling him that. Then he would shake his head and say, well, my memory sucks, so no wonder that I don't remember. I knew I should have backed off at that. Jeff was bad news. Jeff was struggling, and he was possibly at the stage that I knew I should interact with. But going in all the wrong places was something I took delight in. Jeff was the first person in a while who had reminded me I was alive, and that was enough for me to pursue him more, instead of backing off. I tried to come close to him. The next Monday I saw him again. I didn't have his number, and I didn't have his address, so the only way of contacting or meeting each other was this. I thought the best way to suggest sharing such private information was to talk more, or to ask him out. Not in a romantic manner, although that was what I wanted to do, but as friends. We could stop at one of the stations, or his, and go out and eat someplace. We could return to our respective homes then. That was the idea. On Monday, however, when I met him, he still looked exhausted and tired. Unfortunately, there weren't any empty seats around us, so to make sure that he could sit somewhere nearby, I got into an argument with a young, healthy-looking guy. Jeff seemed to think that it was too much and that there was a lot of noise, so I shut up. The other guy seemed to assuage the situation and got up with a small huff. Jeff sat down at my instance and thanked me. Would you like to rest a while? I asked. We can stop somewhere. We can eat. I don't know, he murmured. I get sleepy after eating. I can drop you off at your place, I suggested. No need, he said. Maybe I can come over to yours. Oh, I thought. That hadn't come to my mind at all. Were we close enough for him to suggest something bold? Or maybe I was looking too much into it. Maybe he just needed to sleep after a hearty meal. I would be glad to provide that for him. I knew a good place near my house. We can go there. Cool, he said, and nodded, and then leaned against the seat to stare at nothing. Half an hour later, Jeff was slurping down on his warm chicken soup when I poured some water for him. I knew it was too hot and spicy and he was going to hurt his teeth or tongue. And that did happen. I gave him the glass of water and he sipped on it with a small thank you. Do you like it? I asked and slowly placed some more steaks on his plate. He looked like he needed it. I could see the bony lines of his shoulders and arms. He was so much smaller than me, even though he was only 3 years younger. I wanted to bring him to my mom. I knew she would make sure that he was always well fed. They sell the best soups in this part of town. I know why, Jeff murmured. It's been such a long time since I ate something so warm and delicious. I'm glad. I didn't ask him about his parents. I knew the situation well. I usually cook for myself, but sometimes I'm too tired to cook. When was the last time you ate? The question slipped out of my mouth before I could even think about it. I bit my tongue. Was I crossing some boundary here? Jeff didn't seem offended. He merely shrugged. I don't know. Last night? Last afternoon? Morning? I cannot say. I don't remember. No wonder he was so thin. Would you like something sweet? I asked. I don't know. They have the best desserts, I promise. If you insist, he replied, shyly. I gave a small laugh and ordered enough for both of us. When Jeff said that he liked it a lot, I asked him to pack a bunch for him. I wanted him to take it with him tomorrow. When we walked out of the shop, I expected Jeff to laugh and say that he was only joking about coming over to my place. But he said how tired and sleepy he was, and I couldn't help but propose the idea to him again. He took a minute to reply, but I knew the idea was a yes long before he actually uttered the word. If you don't mind, that is, he added. I don't, I replied. The truth was, it should have rung a bell in our heads. We were still strangers, and yet he was coming over to my place as if we had been friends for the longest time. But then I thought casual flings were a thing, so what was different about this one? Sure, Jeff wasn't coming over for some fling, but I assumed this was how friendship started at my age. I also hoped that maybe this would help warm him up around me. Maybe we could share some things about ourselves, things that we didn't have the guts to share with others. When he walked into my house, I asked him if he wanted to drink something. He replied that he would like some water. I went to the kitchen to bring him one. You have a nice home, he said, and looked around in awe. It was a basic design. There was nothing special about this house. Still, I appreciated his appreciation. I have a special corner. Would you like to see it? I asked and gave him his water. He nodded, but only to look polite, I believed. I brought him to my attic. It wasn't by any means a huge place, but there was a bed, a chair, and my painting stuff. I showed him my corner, the one that I actually loved. I hadn't picked up a brush in ages, but I loved it all the same. You paint? He asked, and walked around the place in awe. Yes, not recently, no, but yes. Can I see? I rubbed my nape. Now that was an intimate thing. He moved to speak. probably to say that I didn't have to if I didn't want to, but I wanted him to see. So with a slight hesitation, I showed him my paintings. I wasn't a great artist by any means, but the little gasp that Jeff left out each time I showed him one seemed to thrill me. Something seemed to come alive in me each time Jeff mapped the lines of my paintings. It really felt and looked like appreciation. I hadn't felt like that in ages. I was in my emotions, so the words tumbled out of my mouth unthinkingly. I used to paint a lot. I'm sure there are some in my basement too, but then I stopped. At first, I told myself it was because I didn't have the time to actually paint. Then I felt stressed out with that thought, so I started believing that the reason I wasn't painting was because I didn't have the time to think about what to draw. But that was an equally frustrating idea, Jeff asked. Yes, I replied, and nodded. That seemed to stress me out even more. I couldn't help but think about my teen years, and the more I thought about those years, the more stressed out I felt. It was like I was missing out on my life, and I didn't know how to gain control back. Then college started, and so did the studies. Painting was at the back of my mind, always, but I never got the time to actually paint something. In frustration and fear that I was losing hold over something that I truly loved, I started forcing myself to draw, and I drew these. I stopped and showed him some unfinished drawings and paintings. They looked like they were made by a child. I was ashamed. I couldn't think. The best possible way to escape that anxiety was just to forget about it and moved on. I just left. Jeff went silent beside me for a minute. Draw something that makes you feel. Huh? I said and looked at him. He shrugged. Start drawing what makes you feel. That should help. Something that makes me feel. A lot of things make me feel. Then it should be easy. Sadness? Draw it. Happiness? Draw it. It's not that easy, I said, and placed my paintings back in their place. I know, he said, and sat down on the bed. It was clean, so I didn't have a reason to warn him about it. But you have to draw before you stop feeling. It hurts when you stop feeling, you know? It gets impossible after that. I don't have the time, I said. Now I was making excuses. You always have the time. Why are you lying to yourself? I sighed. I will, I replied, and promised that I would think about it. Then I asked if he wanted a change of clothes. He said thank you and asked if he could sleep here. I didn't have a reason to let him sleep in my most intimate space, but did I have a problem with him sleeping there? Heck, if he had asked me to sleep on the chair, I would have done that. Yes, you can. If you need anything, you can always call me. I brought him my clothes, and tried to not think about how my clothes seemed to swallow him whole. Even if unconsciously, I decided that Jeff was now my responsibility. The next morning, we both left for our work from my office. It seemed like such a nice setting, and I couldn't help but imagine a future where it'd be the norm for us. Jeff and I leaving this place for our jobs, and then returning to this place in the evening. Yeah, that sounded nice. When we got off at the station and I gave him the desserts I'd bought last night, he smiled at me and leaned on his tippy toes to place a kiss on my cheek. Again, he said, "Thank you, Ryan." Honestly, I couldn't forget the feeling of his touch on my skin. I really wanted to hug him. Jeff's touch had seemed to do this magic so much so that even my boss with his obnoxious behavior couldn't dampen it. On my way home, I saw Jeff again. I was tempted to ask him to stay with me, just so that I could take care of him, but I knew that wouldn't look too good, either. So, although we talked, he never really returned to my place after that, except that one time when I'd given him a gift, but Jeff's birthday was still some weeks away, and I made plans to observe him. When I returned home, the same day, I couldn't help but stay seated in front of the white canvas for the entire night. Even the thought that I had work the next day didn't seem to deter me. I sat in front of the white canvas and mulled over what Jeff had said. Something that made me feel. I knew what it was. In the next few days, Jeff and I met on the same metro route. I observed him each time we met, and I couldn't help but mourn over the fact that I didn't really see many changes in him. He still looked exhausted and still carried the burden of his problems on his slim shoulders. One time, I unconsciously brought my hand to his cheek. We were staring into each other's eyes in silence. His mouth had stopped forming the sentences that he was once so easily making, and when I rubbed a smoothing circle beneath his eyes, he sighed and leaned against my touch. I knew that instant I was in love. It should have freaked me out, but it didn't. Instead, I went home that day and sat down in front of my white canvas. I knew what to draw. On one of those days, during one of our conversations, I asked Jeff about his birthday. "It's in 2 weeks," he replied, and there was no energy in the reply. "I will turn 22. "You said you were already 22. "I said I will turn 22 this year." He tilted his head to the side. But you turn a year older each year, so there's really nothing special about it. I believe the same, but my parents didn't. They'd barge into my home on my birthday and make me cut a cake as if I were still a child. It was a tad bit embarrassing, but I was glad that they showed their love in so many ways. I knew Jeff's didn't, and that was why I understood the gravity of the situation more. Maybe we can go out on your birthday, unless you have plans? I have no plans, he said. But maybe at your place. Yeah, I replied and swallowed. I like those desserts, Ryan. I want to eat them again. I shall bring it tomorrow then, I promised, and we can go again on your birthday. It sounds great, he tiredly replied. A week so, or later. It was the day before Jeff's birthday, and we were on the metro when Jeff said that he wasn't feeling very good. I asked if he wanted to get off, and he replied that he wanted to vomit. On the next station, I gathered him in my arms, and he ended up vomiting in the washroom. I rubbed his back and pushed his hair back. God, he murmured. I hate living like this. It happens sometimes, I soothed. Not with me, no. I have a fucking problem. Nothing seems to go well with me. He was washing his hands when he looked at me through the mirror. I have absolutely no idea why you're sticking to me. It doesn't make sense. You're an amazing person, Jeff. You're so kind, he replied, and wiped his shaking hands on a napkin. I held his hands when he turned to me. I didn't want you to see me like this. You've been so kind to me, and I've been so unsightly. Hey, I said, and I put a hand on his cheek. You've been amazing. You know, my parents would have left me alone here. They wouldn't have cared. I didn't want to say anything that would hurt him, so I stayed silent. I think everything about me would have turned out different had they cared. I get that I can get frustrating at times, but man, I don't like living like this either. If I could help, I'd restart it all. I want more than anyone else. Tomorrow's my birthday, and I asked my mom if she wanted to come over to my place. And she made some lame-ass excuse, and I don't know what to do, Ryan. We can celebrate your birthday, I suggested. I wish my family had the guts to say that. I brought Jeff over to my place again. He slept in the attic. I hid the paintings that were going to be gifts tomorrow, and gave him a warm glass of water to drink. He slept like a baby. When the next morning came, I let him sleep soundly. I knew his work wouldn't start till 12, so I only assumed it would be good for him. I brought his favorite desserts and prepared the meals that he often said he loved. His paintings were already ready, and I'd hoped he'd love them. I didn't know if it was going to make anything after this, but I was glad that he turned out to be pretty good. When Jeff finally came down, I wished him a happy birthday and gave him his birthday presents. Thank you, he said. Thank you, Ryan. Did you like it? I asked. He nodded his head and he looked happy. The smile seemed to reach his eyes and he looked over the paintings. Is this really me? Do you see me like this? My world seems like this with you in it, I replied. He laughed. I didn't know if he understood the weight of my confession. It's pretty, he said. I loved it. Ryan, thank you. And then, as unexpected as it was to me, he leaned up on his tiptoes to kiss me. And this time, it was planted right on my mouth. Surprised as I was, I couldn't say that I wasn't delighted by the touch. I held him around his waist and kissed him back. Do you want to see my workplace? He asked. I nodded with happy tears in my eyes. I rubbed the thumb below his eye and thanked him for trusting me enough to show me his workplace. I like it when you do that, he said. Do what? When you rub your thumb like that on my face. It feels nice. Grounding. Oh, I replied and gently rubbed the thumb over his cheekbone. Like this? Yeah, he replied and nodded. I knew it was still too early to say it, but things were finally looking up. A few weeks later, no sooner had I gotten comfortable with the idea of having a happy ending with Jeff than he disappeared from my life. And the disappearance happened slowly. I remembered one day asking Jeff if he could give me his number. I told him it would be easier to stay in contact then. He said that he would tell me his number later, and then he never did. Each time I reminded him, he seemed to make an excuse out of thin air. Then a few days later, he dipped. There was no sight of him. I couldn't see him in the metros, nor even in the subways. It didn't matter if I took this metro or that one. I wouldn't ever see Jeff. That started freaking me out. The unbearable nature of my boss just seemed to make the situation worse for me. I didn't have his phone number. I didn't have his address. I knew if I were to tell someone this story, they would have replied with a simple, well, are you sure you weren't daydreaming? LOL. Or, how the hell are you never asked for his number or address? And I would reply, yes, that was stupid of me. But what was done was done. The truth was simple. I couldn't find Jeff anywhere. I remember I was in the office when I first thought about it. My boss was again screaming his lungs out at me and one of my colleagues when I remembered that, hey, Jeff did bring me to one of his workplaces. Maybe I could ask them. They must have his phone number or his address. I knew there was a good chance they wouldn't give it me either, but maybe I could beg. The moment the office was over, I ran out of there and to the place where Jeff worked. It was a small flower shop. I looked around. He was nowhere. I asked his boss and he shook his head. He was supposed to be here, he said. It's a sad thing what happened. What happened? I asked. My heart was in my throat. The old man sighed. Did you say your name was Ryan Newman? He asked. I nodded and he gave me an envelope. Jeff gave this to me on his last day. I'm sorry, son, but he is no more. The words didn't seem to register in my head. I walked out of the shop feeling numb, with shaking fingers. I pulled out the little note sitting on the envelope. Something else fell out of it. It was a picture of Jeff. He was holding the paintings I had given him and smiling into the camera. His smile seemed to reach his eyes. I opened the note and dared to read through it. It went on and on. Dear Ryan, I know I'll be late to you when you find this note. I want you to know that you have done more for me than anyone else has. In the few weeks that I have known you, you've proven that I have found someone kinder than you earlier. It would have saved me from a lot of heartache. But the truth is, I stopped. I realized I couldn't read it anymore. Conclusion. Jeff was dead, and I didn't have any idea where the final rites were held. No matter how hard I tried to investigate, look around, or even ask people, it didn't seem to work. What was worse was the fact that he might not even have received a good one. In the following days, as I read over his notes over and over again, I couldn't help but wonder what his final days and final hours were like. Was he thinking of me? Was he hoping that I'd swoop in from somewhere and rescue him? Each time I took the metro, I couldn't help but look at the places he used to sit at. Things at the office seemed tough. When I couldn't handle the pressure anymore, I decided to resign. And when I did that, I wondered what would have happened if Jeff had that option. The end. Was it ever possible for Ryan to save Jeff? Let us know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force and stay wholesome.